So you probably noticed from online that the talk actually has a couple of alternate titles. One of them is on being not good enough, and the other is on being not enough. And I hope we'll get a little bit to speak a little bit at the end about on being not enough. Because that's true also. And what I wrote for the description, meditation is a practice of deeply knowing what's true. In the past 2 evenings, we've been exploring the ways that the critical voice tries to help. It really is just a friend who's trying to help. It tries to help us avoid or prematurely fix what's true by imagining and then telling us that somehow I, you, he, she, they should be otherwise. So in this evening's offering, we'll try to talk a little bit more about ways to befriend the critical voice. Perhaps in part by understanding it deeply, and also just, kind of a little bit more about how to work with it. And somebody asked me if you've missed the first 2 parts, how bad is that? Well, it's a matter of opinion, I'm sure, but we'll try to touch on some points, but there may be places where I'll repeat something and then you go, I'd like to know a little bit more about that. That may be in one of those earlier talks. I've talked about the critical voice being a fairly uniquely Western phenomenon. And one of the problems in working with the critical voice in our spiritual practice is that sometimes teachers whose orientation is primarily in Eastern cultures really don't understand how it works and can inadvertently invite us even to use our spiritual practice in the service of the critical voice, which is not at all what either they or we intend. The definition that I like best about the critical voice is any voice, internal or external, that drives but doesn't nourish, that responds without first seeing and acknowledging with love and grace. So any voice, any that tries to fix something or that tries to acknowledge or tries to act without kindness, love, and grace. Ajahn Suchito, you've heard me say this many times in the course of these talks, defines, has some bullet points. He says, setting up a lot of goals that we or others are unlikely to achieve anytime soon, using a lot of shoulds, using words like never or always or recriminations. He says, a sense of, I didn't quite make it and I'm not likely to. And there could be a way out if I just tried a bit harder or did something to fix myself, then I would be okay. And my favorite teacher, John Wellwood, talked about the critical voice as a harsh inner voice that acts as a judge, telling them that nothing they do is ever quite good enough. You should meditate more and practice harder. You're too self-centered or too angry or too passive or too fill in the blank. and you don't have enough devotion. So he says people strive to be dharmically correct, attempting to be more detached, compassionate, kind, or devoted than they really are. In trying to live up to high spiritual ideas, they deny their real feelings, becoming cut off from their bodily vitality, the truth of their own experience, and their ability to find their own authentic direction. So the critical voice cuts us off really from our life energy and our way to find our own authentic direction. Our spiritual practice invites us to allow experience internally and externally. You've heard me say occasionally, it's like this now. Seeing where there is affliction or woundedness or pain, and then allowing ourselves to see clearly what's needed. And if not, we run the risk of having a critical voice about our critical voice, about our critical voice, about our critical voice. It goes on endlessly, because we could also have a critical voice about having the critical voice. I spoke in a couple of in the earlier talks about how it happens that we in the West have actually what is rather widely understood to be a rather distinctly Western issue in working with the Dharma, that I think maybe is in some of the earlier talks, and that some of the Eastern teachers have absolutely no idea what we are talking about when we speak of the critical voice, or the ways that we can interpret their teachings within the frame of that critical voice. Nevertheless, this is perhaps a useful frame, and I spoke about perception a bit in one of the earlier talks, and I would propose that our critical voice, any voice that remains steadfastly harsh and critical, any voice that remains steadfastly harsh and critical, is pushing something outward that actually needs to be dealt with internally more deeply. Trying to not experience something internally by projecting something outward. And there the issue is a steadfast, harsh, and critical voice. I made the distinction, I think a number of times in the earlier talks, between a voice that is critical and a voice that is discerning. We can discern. I told the story about my little grandson. We can discern that a behavior is unwholesome. And that might need some curiosity or some investigation. We can discern. But the critical voice is a voice that goes beyond discernment to some should or some judgment about self or other, about how it should be. And the teaching in the Dharma is that things will reveal what is needed when we are present with them with love and grace. As I was thinking about this, I was thinking we should do, maybe I will, do a weekend retreat on unconditional presence, working with presence. How can we be present with everything that arises? And it was one of the huge gifts that my teacher, John Wellwood, gave when I studied with him for almost 20 years. Unconditional presence. So that the critical voice doesn't discern what unconditional presence is, but sort of commands a certain way of being. Anybody who doesn't understand what I mean by a critical voice that is internally harsh and judgmental? Somebody once asked, I was in a therapist workshop, and we were talking about marital problems, and the leader said, could anyone here who has never had a marital difficulty, would you raise your hand, please? Didn't happen. So in part one, especially, we talked about the conditioned reasons why our critical voice can be so strong, why it can be difficult to see, and allow our experience to be what it is. We talked a lot about the psychology aspect of the critical voice, the ways that that critical voice can be learned. So our spiritual practice, learning how to be with life as it is and let it teach us what is needed, is exactly that. It's a practice. It's a practice. It's a practice. It's not a set of rules about how we are supposed to be, but a set of guidelines for if we want to be happy, we can explore these avenues. And those avenues are a little bit different. The forms that they take are a little bit different for each of us. So at first, in a situation where we find ourselves with a critical voice, we are initially lost in identification. This is me. Or alternately, this is him. Or they. This is who they are. This is who I am. And initially, we're just lost in that identification, so much so that we don't even know we are lost in identification. So if we hear a critical voice about ourselves, and actually much of what I'm saying applies to a critical voice, if we're kind of relentlessly critical, different from discerning, if we are relentlessly critical about somebody else, it may be a very similar issue, that there's something that they are doing or being or whatever that is causing some discomfort internally, and I don't want to be with my discomfort long enough to see what's needed. I want to fix it. I want to do something, and better yet, I want you to be different so that I won't be uncomfortable. So to discern, oh, there's something, and we could even discern, the story I told about my grandson, we could even discern clearly, a small child hitting his sister for no reason. It isn't like we would then smile and say, oh, isn't that sweet? We can discern that that is an unskillful behavior, but the critical voice isn't helpful there. What we want is some curiosity and investigation. What's happening? What's needed? I'll tell you, I hope to get to another story later. So initially, we're lost in identification. After a while, we can maybe notice that there is a critical voice operating, and we can begin to acknowledge, just acknowledge it. Here it is. Without trying to fix it. Can we just notice it? Because there we're coming out of identification and beginning to reflect on our experience, beginning to have awareness of experience. I invited some of that in the meditation. Can we just notice? and begin to acknowledge this is what is happening. Those two steps are really key, because sometimes what we do when we see something that we think should be otherwise is we skip the recognition, we skip the acknowledgement, and we go immediately to let me fix it. We can't fix it really until we understand more clearly, we see more clearly what's happening and what's needed. So initially, can we come out of identification when we hear that critical voice? Get going. Acknowledge it. Maybe even acknowledge it, no maybe about it, with kindness. We talked earlier in the series about this critical voice that's trying to help, because there were certain qualities and certain aspects of our experience that were unacceptable according to certain important people, and therefore we learned to try to hide them. I mentioned that sometimes when we're on retreat and we're spending an extended period in meditation, what happens is that some of those those experiences that we've been trying to kind of sit on and stuff, they start to come up, and then our critical voice could be super activated in the sense of, oh, this is not what's supposed to be happening in my spiritual practice. Actually, it is. But we can have this idea that our spiritual practice is supposed to be serene and easeful at all moments, at all times, and that if it isn't, or if there's some of this unacceptable experience that's arising, that we must be doing something wrong. Now, it is true that we do need to contain it in a way that is useful and wholesome. It is not, and so discerning it is useful, but criticizing it is not so much. And I wanted to respond, there were some really lovely questions, and maybe there will be more tonight. I wanted to respond specifically to some of the questions that were asked in the earlier two talks. And one of the questions was, what would I be doing if not criticizing? What would I be doing if not criticizing? And my answer there is, we would be practicing the Dharma. We would be practicing the Dharma. We would be practicing the Dharma. We would not necessarily be enlightened beings, but we would be practicing the Dharma. Specifically, we would come into awareness. It's like this now. There's this critical voice again. It's like this now. Knowing, we would know that we are caught in suffering. Does any of that sound like the Dharma to you? We would know that we are caught in suffering. Knowing equals discernment. We're caught in something that isn't wholesome. It isn't wholesome for me, it isn't wholesome for other beings. I remember my little grandson is socking his sister in the head. It was not wholesome. He's caught. Indeed, we would know that. We would reflect, is this to my welfare or to the welfare of others? Remember, the Buddha invites us in one of the suttas, he's speaking to his little son, Rahula, who's about, 12 years old or something like that. And he tells him, he said, before you do an action, you should reflect on it. Is this for my benefit or the benefit of others? He says, while you do an action, you should reflect on it. Is this to my benefit or the benefit of others? And then after you do an action, and he says, a bodily action, a verbal action, or a mental action. He goes through it in the ways that the suttas do, relentless detail, repeating it. but he says you should reflect on it before, during, and after a bodily, verbal, or mental action. You should reflect on it. Is this wholesome? Is this for my welfare or the welfare of others? And again, the question is discernment, different from judgment and criticism. Criticism pushes things down, discernment opens them up. We might need to feel something that is unpleasant, an emotion perhaps. When, I don't know that I mentioned it in much detail, but the story I told about my grandson was that my initial response was total confusion. You know, here we were having these very pleasant moments, and I had no, and then he went and hit his sister. I had no idea what happened. And I did not like to experience confusion. Unpleasant. So allowing ourselves to experience whatever is the experience of it with kindness and grace. Somebody else does something that's unskillful. Ouch. I don't like it. Can I allow the experience of not liking it with mercy, grace, kindness? Can I be curious? What is needed here? For me, in that case, what was needed is I needed to consult with a friend of mine. I said, Bob, you're a child development guy. What just happened? And he helped me understand what had happened. Oh, right. Okay. That makes sense. I see what's needed. Another piece is just to have a practice that is reflecting on our progress and our goodness. Someone wrote to me this last week, said, could you send me to the sutta that says that? I said, sure, I'd be happy to. But if we don't give ourselves credit for the progress that we make and the things that we learn and grow in, it's all too dry. It's too hard. You've heard me tell this story. There was a story about the Dalai Lama who was meeting, he was at a gathering of Eastern teachers or something at Spirit Rock, and he met with the kitchen staff, as he is wont to do. And somebody said, I get so discouraged about my practice that I just feel like I'm just not really making any progress. And the Dalai Lama said, yeah, me too. He said, but then when I look back over the last 10 years, I see that things are a little better. I'm not as angry as I used to be. He famously is very open about his struggles with anger and anxiety. But he says, yeah, me too. It's hard. But the Buddha very specifically invites us to notice our goodness and our progress as sort of the container in which this discernment lands. And did I mention practice? Our practice is a practice. And we can't always do it by ourselves. Sometimes we need friends. With my grandson, I needed my friend Bob to help me understand what was happening and what was mine to do. And the reason for that isn't that one person is necessarily more brilliant than the other, but one of the earlier talks I talked a good bit about perception and the ways that our perceptions get organized. And given that we have certain ways of perceiving things, we need other people who can help us perceive them differently and see them differently, because we get locked into our own perceptions. It's just true for all of us. That each of us is going to be in a little bit different place around that dance at different times also. We're in a different place and at different times. So we need to keep inquiring. We need to keep inquiring into ways that we have. The critical voice says, I have to have it this way or I cannot be happy. I have to have it this way internally. I have to have it this way externally. Now, one of the questions that keeps coming up is, okay, so what if I'm in an abusive relationship? Maybe you can't change it. Maybe you can. Maybe you can't. How is it? What are your options? Where's freedom? There's no single dharmically correct answer to that. However, we could imagine that it might be a call to develop certain qualities that are not as strong as they might be. Qualities of discernment. Oh, you know what? I lived with this for X number of years and never noticed it. Or, you know what? When I get angry and set limits, I get incredibly anxious and I don't like to feel anxious. Or I'm afraid people will judge me or whatever, so it really is a very personal inquiry. There's another question that was asked that said, why are patterns so different across people? How come the other person isn't thinking, saying, doing the same as me? Fundamentally, I think the answer to that one is only love is real. Only love is universal. There's a talk I give, only love is real, everything, or Carole King sings that song, only love is real, everything else is illusion. And the reference to everything else is illusion is that that part of our perception that gets buried in the subconscious and in the unconscious. That we learn to perceive. Everything that we perceive is learned. Even what this thing is. Even the fact that it's a thing, we had to learn that. And somebody who lives in the Amazon rainforest may not perceive it in exactly the same way. But everything is like that. Only love is real. Now, how come our patterns are so different? And our patterns are so, I literally remember the day that I first saw that. It's like, really? Not everybody thinks the same way I do? I was embarrassingly old to learn that. So how come, we think differently? I don't know, past lives? We come in differently, we have different temperaments, we have different conditioning, we live in different cultures, we have different life experiences, we practice differently, we practice certain skills differently. Some of us get really anxious if we're, girls are supposed to be this way, boys are supposed to be that way. We get really anxious if we act out of that conditioning. And then there are the Buddhist defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion that operate in different circumstances with more or less vengeance for each of us. So we all perceive things differently. It's just fascinating to me to, yeah, I don't know why I'm doing this really. But I just started to read a biography of Osama bin Laden. You know, it's just, how does this work? I'm not sure, I'll let you know, I'm not sure it's really wholesome for me to be doing that, but nevertheless, that's what I'm doing. You know, how does this work? How do people's minds work in such a way? Just really interesting, you know. And then another question that came up, I'm stumbling with moral issues. Was that a, no. Stumbling with moral issues, aren't I accepting the unacceptable? You know, so the answer to that is first, we don't have to accept the unacceptable. My grandson's behavior was unacceptable. He needs to be corrected. That's not okay. I don't care what you're feeling. I don't care how bad your day is. Not okay to hit your sister in the head. What can I say? So we're not talking about accepting the unacceptable. We're talking about how we respond. So if I make a mistake and I have never done this, and forget to put the coffee pot under the thing that brews it, and the coffee goes all over the kitchen. I've never actually done that, and you understand. Well, maybe once. If, you know, we say, well, okay, that was a mistake. Let's not do that again. And there are big mistakes, unacceptable mistakes, but unacceptable in the sense of we need to correct it and put boundaries around it, and maybe put the coffee pot under the coffee machine the next time. But to criticize, to discern that that was a mistake is one thing, but to give myself a hard time about it is just not helpful. And for somebody else to give me a hard time about it is not helpful. So the question is how we respond. And sometimes we have to look underneath the surface. Sometimes we just can't know. You know, there are certain politicians, I don't know why they behave the way they do. I'm trying to figure out what made Osama bin Laden tick, but you know, I don't know. Sometimes we just can't know, but we can look underneath the surface. And here's my other story. Some of you have heard this story before. So I was in Starbucks one day, typing away on my little computer, and everybody else busy. It was really full. And all of a sudden, there was this little 2-year-old shrieking in such a way that it was filling Starbucks, just bouncing off the walls, absolutely bouncing off the walls, just so upset, crying, upset, screaming, hitting his father, just awful. And what happened next was so beautiful because actually, and the father had another, like a 5-year-old with him too, who was sort of standing there next to him. And the father picked up the little one in his arms and 100% ignored everyone else in Starbucks. I don't know that I could have been quite that focused. He had 100% of his attention with the little one. And he started talking to him in a way that my friend Bob Marvin calls reading through the cues. He started talking to him. He's up in his little ear, and the little one is kind of floundering around, still screaming. And he says, yeah, Mama went to the store, and you don't like that. but she'll be back in a minute. And you know what? Then we'll go home and I think it's nap time. And I bet you'd like some lunch before nap. "Mm, yeah, yeah, I would. What do you think you'd like for lunch? Would a grilled cheese yeah, that'd be okay. That'd be okay. And so he read through the cues. He didn't try to address the behavior directly, but he read underneath it to what was going on and addressed that. So beautifully, it was a marvel to see and hear and witness. And that was what my friend Bob helped me see with my grandson, reading through the cues. Oh, he was sad and he didn't know how to navigate his sadness. Oh, that makes total sense. So anger works better for a 5-year-old than sadness in that case. Knew how to do that one. So the invitation really is to kind of look underneath the surface, look deeply with kindness, with grace, and see what's going on here. And maybe what's going on is something simple like, oh, I just forgot to get the coffee pot out of the dishwasher. Well, a simple forgetfulness. And maybe we don't know, and we can't know with other people. One thing about us as adults, it's one thing to do that with a child. It's instructive to see it happening with a child, but we can't know with adults, with other adults, what's going on for them. So it isn't like we start then, kind of psychologizing people and say, okay, here's what's going on for you. We don't know. All we know is what's going on for me. I'm really uncomfortable with this, and I would like you to look and see what's going on. And maybe they will, maybe they won't. That's informative. So the invitation is not to make nice and simply ignore what is unskillful in thought, words, and deed, but the question is how we go about it. And again, remember that this critical voice is a uniquely Western phenomenon. Eastern teachers don't know what we're talking about. So the practice is that we're working with our patterns and with our brain's conditioning as we interpret the spiritual teachings through the lens of our Western culture. And then I mentioned earlier, part of our practice is celebrating our goodness. The Buddha, remember, invites us to celebrate our virtues, to contemplate them, to contemplate our generosity, which is really kind of dropping into an awareness of that basic goodness, the basic being that is our nature. It's actually what Susan was talking about last week, that we're kind of practicing dropping into that awareness, which for most of us at this stage of I'll speak for myself, at this stage of my practice really happens only in short little moments where I really drop into that kind of clarity. I don't really live there. So spiritual practice is not about becoming something or someone. It's about discernment, coming to see clearly and deeply what's true, externally, internally, with kindness and compassion. Just simply letting go of what's not deeply true in your own life, in your own being, in your own world. Pema Chodron says, if your everyday practice is to open to all your emotions, to all the people you meet, to all the situations you encounter without closing your heart down, trusting that you can do that, then that will take you as far as you can go. And then you will understand all the teachings that anyone has ever taught. And just one little moment, and maybe this will be another talk sometime, on being not enough. So I've been talking about being not good enough. You know, we're also not enough. We can't fix the dukkha in the world, the suffering in the world. We can't fix other people. Everyone has to take it on for themselves. I have a dear friend who just lost a very dear relative who died of addictions. Nothing they did, and it was heroic and valiant, nothing they did worked. So we're not always enough. The Buddha wasn't enough. You've heard us talk about, the Buddha one time tried really, really hard to stop a war. He succeeded twice. The third time he went back, again, let's talk about this, let's do diplomacy. And the third time it failed, and his whole home village was killed. He failed. So we can't be enough to fix the world, but we can be enough to practice with ourselves and to inquire, how does this spiritual teaching, what applies here? What's needed here? All beings are the owners of their karma. Their happiness and unhappiness depends on their actions, not on my wishes for them. No matter how much I might wish it to be otherwise, things are as they are. Although I wish only the best for you, I also know that your happiness and unhappiness depends on your actions, not on my wishes for you. Whether I understand it or not, things are unfolding according to ancient and natural law. All beings are owners of their own karma. All beings, all families, all communities, the community of Charlottesville, all nations, the United States, the Ukraine, Nigeria. All beings are owners of their own karma. So our practice is to learn to sit as much as we can in the goodness of being. Only love is real. And to let our practice guide us when we find ourselves puzzled and stuck. All right. Oh, I can't help myself. We're over time, but I'll read one more poem. The guest is inside you and also inside me. You know the sprout is hidden inside the seed. We are all struggling. None of us has gone far. Let your arrogance go and look around inside. The blue sky opens out farther and farther. The daily sense of failure goes away. The damage I have done to myself fades. A million suns come forward with light when I sit firmly in that world. I hear bells ringing that no one has shaken. Inside love, there is more joy than we know of. Rain pours down, although the sky is clear of clouds. There are whole rivers of light. The universe is shot through in all parts by a single sort of love. How hard it is to feel that joy in all our four bodies. Those who hope to be reasonable about it fail. The arrogance of reason has separated us from that love. With the word reason, you already feel miles away. How lucky Kabir is, this is a poem by Kabir, is that surrounded by all this joy, he sings inside his own little boat. His poems amount to one soul meeting another. His poems amount to one soul meeting another. So here we are, meeting one another, helping each other. May we continue.